Ukrainian troops shelled a popular marketplace in the Donbass capital city of Donetsk on Sunday, killing at least 27 civilians. That, according to reports in Russian and other international media. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov called the attack a heinous act of terrorism, and Moscow sent the head of its foreign ministry, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, to an emergency meeting Monday at the UN Security Council to discuss the attack.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today we are once again discussing the situation in Ukraine in the context of continued Western weapons supplies into the country, and also in the context of sending Western mercenaries there. We undertook, in the wake of that, measures to eliminate the French mercenaries near Kharkiv. We just heard the statement of Mr. Ibo, Deputy to High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. We are grateful for the information and recommendations to Security Council. Today, the absolute majority of unbiased experts see very clearly that the key factor which impedes ways towards a peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis is a continued support on the part of the West to the regime in Kiev. And despite the fact that it is obviously in agony and it is incapable of attaining the goal set to itself, namely to inflict strategic defeat on Russia or, as is being said recently, to at least weaken my country. The reality is such that despite the complete failure of UAF on the battlefield, the Western patrons of the Kiev regime continue pushing them. They're maniacal in this. They continue pushing them towards continuing with a senseless military confrontation. And this is done under the guise of false words, saying that the crash of the Zelensky regime would be an existential threat for the Ukrainians, and Russia wants to subjugate them. Those who look deeply into the genesis of the Ukrainian crisis can see very clearly that such statements contain not an iota of truth. Russia began the special military operation in February 2022, and it wasn't against Ukraine, and it wasn't against the Ukrainian people. We had to start the military operation against an overzealous criminal regime acting with impunity, who decided, despite many years-long efforts, the regime which decided not to reject war against their own citizens in the south and southeast of Ukraine, or to reject the policy of total discrimination of Russian-speaking Ukrainians who are still a majority in that country. And the Zelensky regime did this not only in violation of the Minsk agreements approved by the Security Council, but also in violation of elementary principles of civilized society and how it should be functioning, and whilst grossly violating foundational human rights, including the rights of national minorities, which are enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution. And the Western patrons of the Kiev regime, who are behind the unconstitutional coup in Kiev 10 years ago, throughout this time not only did not rein in the leaders of the Kiev clique, but also, in addition, on the sly, under the guise of the Minsk agreements, continued arming Ukraine and preparing it for war with Russia.
The U.S. Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, Robert Wood, had this to say in reply to Lavrov's comments.
It is cynicism of the highest order to claim that legitimate and lawful support for Ukraine's self-defense is prolonging Russia's war of aggression. It bears repeating. There are hundreds of thousands of Russian troops in Ukraine's internationally recognized territory. There is not a single Ukrainian soldier on Russian soil. The Russian representative's accusations would sound more credible if his government respected international law, the UN Charter, and Security Council resolutions.
Shortly before making his comments, Wood received an uncharacteristically blunt statement from China's permanent representative, Zhang Jun.
The Ukraine crisis, by the looks of it, is becoming a protracted, complex one, which China finds regrettable and worrying, given the increasing number of factors contributing to insecurity and instability globally. Ending the Ukraine crisis, halting the hostilities, and restoring peace is felt more urgently than ever. All parties should work harder to that end. First, we must be committed to common security. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries must be respected, and security is indivisible. No country may attempt to secure itself at the expense of another country's security. Nor can regional security be guaranteed by way of muscling up or even expanding a military bloc. The consequences of NATO's eastward expansion indicate that seeking so-called absolute security at the expense of other countries' security will only widen the security deficit and trust deficit. It will do nothing to make our world more peaceful and stable. In this regard, NATO would do well to learn its lesson. Russia and Ukraine are neighbors that cannot move away from each other, even if they wanted to. Their respective legitimate security concerns should be taken seriously by each other. The ultimate way out of the conundrum lies in an effort on the part of both countries and other parties concerned to build a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture guided by the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security. Second, negotiations must be resumed as soon as possible. There are no winners in conflict or war. Peace cannot be achieved by feeding weapons into the battlefield, and prolonged fighting will only result in more civilian casualties. We urge compliance with international humanitarian law to the letter and effective protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We must remain highly vigilant about nuclear safety risks. Diplomatic efforts must not be abandoned or given up under any circumstances. We call for the prompt launch of direct engagement and stepwise resumption of negotiations with a view to forging consensus to end the hostilities. The international community and the UN should create enabling conditions to that end. Other parties should refrain from any unconstructive action or any irresponsible rhetoric. Third, humanitarian needs must be effectively addressed. With a high incidence of devastating attacks and civilian casualties, the destruction of infrastructure, and the inclement winter weather, humanitarian needs in conflict areas are on the rise, and the humanitarian situation is distressing. We support the international community and the humanitarian organizations in stepping up their effort to provide wintering relief for the populations in the affected areas, improve humanitarian conditions on the ground, and head off a humanitarian crisis of a greater magnitude. Fourth, we must spare no effort to stem the spillover of the crisis. At a time when the Palestinian-Israeli conflict drags on and some hotspot issues are at the risk of flaring up, the world cannot afford to see further spreading of geopolitical clashes. At the same time, the global economy is slowing down. Developing countries are finding it even harder to achieve the SDGs on the 2030 agenda. And the negative impacts of the Ukraine crisis and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict have added snow to the icy cold global economy. Countries with significant influence should take a responsible approach, refrain from politicizing, instrumentalizing, or weaponizing the world economy, and should instead work together to maintain global food, energy, and financial security, as well as the stability and smooth functioning of industrial and supply chains. Mr. President, the Ukraine issue has got to where it is today as a result of a tangle of complex factors, which deserve our serious reflection. If we look around, our world is beset with wars and conflicts, risks and challenges, bringing all manner of uncertainties and threats into international peace and security. Complex problems being complex, they defy simple fixes. Confronted with all these challenges, the ultimate solution is for us to work harder to build a community with a shared future for humankind, shape a world blessed with lasting peace and universal security. All countries should play their parts and work together in this direction. China will continue to stand on the side of peace and on the side of justice, with a tireless effort for international peace and security. Thank you.
After nearly 2 hours of discussion, The meeting adjourned with no action taken. For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.